Here is what you need to know before this story begins. A mother-in-law looked her daughter-in-law dead in the eye, snatched the keys to her car right out of her hand, and said with a smile dripping in poison, "A woman like you doesn't deserve to drive anything I haven't approved." What Dorothea Hargrove Calloway did not know, could not have known, and would have begged God to undo the moment she found out was this. Her daughter-in-law, Sloane, was the only child of Gerald Whitmore, the man who quietly owned the largest luxury auto dealership chain on the entire East Coast. Every single vehicle registered under Dorothea's company, every Range Rover, every Mercedes, every Escalade she used to announce her importance to the world, had been financed and titled through Gerald's network. And on the night Dorothea smirked and dangled those confiscated keys like a trophy, Gerald Whitmore was already parked at the end of the driveway, a velvet key box on the passenger seat beside him, and a folder of financial fraud evidence thick enough to choke on sitting in his briefcase. By morning, Dorothea would not own a single vehicle. By the end of the week, she would not own much else either. If someone used the excuse of keeping you under control to strip away your independence while your spouse was conveniently out of town, would you quietly endure it, or would you burn the entire arrangement to the ground? Drop your answer in the comments right now and make sure you like and subscribe before we go any further, because this story does not slow down for a single second. Sloane Whitmore met Everett Calloway the way most genuinely terrible romantic stories begin, which is to say she met him at the exact moment in her life when she was most willing to believe that a man who seemed stable and warm and attentive was actually stable and warm and attentive. She was 27. She had just returned to Connecticut after 4 years in Boston, where she had quietly completed a dual degree in finance and organizational management, not because her father had pushed her toward it, but because Sloane had always understood instinctively that money was a language, and she wanted to be fluent before the world had any chance to use that illiteracy against her. Gerald Whitmore had built his dealership empire slowly, methodically, beginning with a single lot in Fairfield County in the early 90s and expanding outward through 2 decades of deliberate acquisition, until the Whitmore Auto Group operated 14 luxury franchises across Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. He had done all of it without splashing his name across billboards or appearing in local news segments, or attending the kinds of charity galas where men like him were expected to perform generosity for an audience. Gerald was a quiet billionaire in the truest sense of the phrase. He wore the same brand of dark wash jeans to work that he had worn for 20 years. He drove a 4-year-old Chevy Tahoe that his own dealerships would have considered a trade-in. He had raised Sloane with a single animating philosophy, which he had stated plainly to her on the morning of her 16th birthday while handing her not a car but a copy of her first brokerage account statement. He had said, "Sloane, anyone who knows what you're worth before you decide to tell them already has a plan for it. Don't let anyone have a plan for you." Sloane had carried those words like a quiet amulet through every room she had ever entered. She did not advertise her last name in professional settings. She did not correct people who assumed she was middle class. She drove a sensible, clean 3-year-old Volvo XC60 that she had purchased herself with her own salary from the private wealth management firm where she had worked since returning to Connecticut. She lived in a neat, modest apartment in Westport. She cooked her own meals. She did not wear jewelry that required explanation. She was, by every visible measure, a self-sufficient and professionally accomplished woman of no particular extraordinary financial standing, and that was precisely the way Gerald had taught her to appear until she decided otherwise. She met Everett at a colleague's birthday dinner in New Haven. He was tall, conventionally handsome in the broad-shouldered, country club casual way of men raised in Greenwich, and he laughed at the right moments and asked follow-up questions when she spoke, which in her experience at 27 was still rare enough to register as meaningful. He worked in commercial real estate development, he said, managing acquisitions for his family's portfolio. He seemed intelligent. He seemed grounded. He called her the next morning, not 3 days later, and Sloane, who was careful about most things, found herself being slightly less careful about this. What she did not fully understand in those early months was the architecture of the family she was being introduced to. Everett's mother, Dorothea Hargrove Calloway, was a woman who had been raised in moderate comfort in Westchester and had married into the Calloway family's real estate money in her mid-20s, after which she had spent the following 3 decades behaving as though the money had always been hers and always would be. She was 61 years old at the time Sloane met Everett, with the particular posture of a woman who had decided at some point in her 40s that cruelty performed with perfect manners was indistinguishable from class. She wore St. John knit suits in shades of ivory and champagne. She had her hair set every Thursday at a salon in Greenwich whose prices she mentioned in casual conversation the way other people mentioned the weather. She had the handshake of someone who has decided before extending it whether you are worth the energy. She met Sloane for the first time at Sunday brunch at the Callaway Estate in Greenwich, which was a 12,000 square foot colonial revival on nearly 3 acres, and within 4 minutes of that meeting she had asked Sloane 3 questions that were not questions at all. She had asked which firm Sloane worked for, and when Sloane named it, Dorothea had tilted her head and said, "Oh, that's a lovely little firm." She had asked where Sloane's family was from, and when Sloane said Fairfield County, Dorothea had smiled and said, "How sweet, the county is really growing." And she had looked at Sloane's Cartier watch, a simple tank solo that Gerald had given her on her college graduation, and said with the brightness of someone paying a compliment, "That's a very convincing replica, dear. I almost didn't notice." Sloane had smiled. She had said nothing. And somewhere behind her sternum, a very specific and patient kind of fury had begun its long, quiet accumulation. Everett proposed 14 months after that first dinner. He did it on the terrace of the apartment in Westport, on a Tuesday evening in October when the trees along the shoreline had gone fully amber, and he said the things a man says when he means them, or at least when he believes he means them, which Sloane would later understand are not always the same. She said yes. She loved him. She believed, with the particular confidence of a woman who had built careful assessments of most things, that she understood who he was. She did not yet understand that Everett Callaway, for all his genuine warmth and intermittent decency, had never in 33 years of life successfully resisted his mother for longer than 2 weeks. The wedding was held the following June at the Callaway estate. It was elegant, controlled, and organized entirely by Dorothea, who had presented Sloane with a binder of decisions already made and called it collaboration. The florist was Dorothea's florist. The caterer was Dorothea's caterer. The seating chart placed Gerald Whitmore, who had driven up from Fairfield in his 4-year-old Tahoe wearing a quietly perfect navy suit, at a table near the back with Everett's college friends rather than at the family table, because, as Dorothea explained to Everett in a voice Sloane was not supposed to overhear, "We don't really know her people and we need to seat family with family." Gerald had sat at that back table with perfect equanimity, eaten the salmon, and danced with Sloane for the father-daughter dance with the specific expression of a man who has already done the calculations and found them satisfactory. He had leaned close to her ear during the second chorus and said quietly, "You know exactly what you're doing, sweetheart. So do I. Just remember the number." Sloane had known exactly which number he meant. The number in the trust. The number that had been growing without interruption since before she had learned to read. The first year of marriage was conducted largely at the Callaway estate, because Everett's commercial real estate work required him to be in Greenwich, and because Dorothea had strongly suggested that it was wasteful for a newly married couple to rent when the east wing of the family property had a full 2-bedroom suite sitting empty. Sloane had agreed to this arrangement with a tranquility that she would later recognize as the first payment on a very expensive education. She had believed, at the time, that proximity would breed familiarity and that familiarity would soften Dorothea's architecture of small cruelties. She had been wrong about this in the specific way that generous people are wrong about cruel ones, which is to say she had projected her own capacity for adaptation onto someone who had never intended to adapt. The micro-abuses were not dramatic. That was what made them so effective and so exhausting. Dorothea did not scream. She did not make scenes. She operated in the register of the perfectly worded remark, the withheld acknowledgement, the comparison deployed as a compliment. She would mention at dinner that Everett's college girlfriend, a woman named Beatrix who had gone on to marry a hedge fund manager in Darien, had redecorated her kitchen in the most sophisticated way, while sliding a glance toward the arrangement of herbs Sloane kept on the windowsill of the suite. She would ask Sloane questions about her work at the wealth management firm with the specific cadence of someone tolerating a child's explanation of an imaginary game. When Sloane cooked dinner for the family on the evenings their shared schedule overlapped, Dorothea would eat it in silence, then say to Everett within Sloane's hearing, "Your grandmother's housekeeper used to make this dish. She was from outside Guadalajara." When Gerald visited on weekends and sat quietly at the kitchen island drinking coffee and listening to Sloane talk about her week, Dorothea would appear in the doorway and say, with a smile so refined it could not be objected to, "We're not really a coffee at the island family, But of course you're welcome to do as you like in your own culture. Sloane documented none of this. She told Everett about some of it in the careful, unhysterical way she told him everything, and Everett would absorb the information with visible discomfort and then say in slightly varying iterations that his mother was old-fashioned, that she meant well, that she would come around, that Sloane perhaps sometimes misread the tone. And Sloane, who never misread tone, would nod and return to the slow accumulation of her patience. What Sloane was doing during these months, and what no one in the Calloway household understood, was working. She was still employed full-time at the wealth management firm, still managing a client portfolio with a combined value that would have made Dorothea's eyes go genuinely wide had she known it, and she was also, quietly and methodically, building the precise map of everything around her. She noted the vehicles. She noted the way Dorothea referenced the Calloway Company account when discussing the family's fleet of cars, 7 vehicles in total including 2 Range Rovers, a Mercedes GLS, a Porsche Cayenne, an Escalade and a BMW 7 Series, all of them leased or purchased through dealerships whose franchise agreements, though Dorothea had no way of knowing this, fell under the Whitmore Auto Group's ownership umbrella. She noted the name on the company that held the vehicle registrations, Hargrove Property Management LLC, which was a subsidiary of the broader Calloway holding structure, but which Dorothea effectively controlled independently. She noted the credit lines, the payment histories, the insurance binders, the lease renewal cycles. She noted all of it with the comprehensive and undramatic attention of a woman trained to read financial architecture the way other people read text. She called her father on a Wednesday evening in the second year of her marriage, standing in the small garden at the back of the east wing where the cell reception was clearest, and she described what she had observed. Gerald had listened without interrupting, which was his habit, and then he had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, "Hargrove Property Management. That's the entity on the vehicle titles." And Sloane had confirmed it. And Gerald had said, simply and without particular emphasis, "I'm going to make a few calls in the morning." He had not elaborated. He did not need to. There were other things Sloane noted during those accumulating months, details that individually seemed like the ordinary texture of a difficult living situation but which, assembled together, revealed something more deliberate and more systematic than simple bad manners. Dorothea had, on 3 separate occasions over the course of the second year, invited Sloane's colleagues from the wealth management firm to estate events and then introduced her as Everett's wife, who works in finance, something with portfolios in a tone that managed to make a senior portfolio manager's role sound like a seasonal part-time position. She had once, at a dinner attended by 2 of Everett's closest friends and their wives, referenced a news article about a local business failure and said, with the thoughtful expression of someone making an observation rather than an attack, "It reminds me of those small firms that can't quite survive when the market moves. The kind where the clients are loyal, but the leadership just doesn't have the range." She had then looked at Sloane with an expression of complete pleasantness and said, "No offense to your world, dear." Sloane had said, "None taken," and refilled her water glass, and across the table she had caught the eye of one of the wives, a woman named Caroline whose husband ran a hedge fund and who had the specific expression of someone watching a performance they were not sure how to categorize. Caroline had sent Sloane a text the following Monday that said simply, "I don't know how you do it." Sloane had replied, "Patience is a financial instrument. You hold it long enough and it compounds." Caroline had not responded for a full minute and then sent back 3 laughing emojis and a fire emoji, which Sloane had considered an appropriate review. The crisis arrived on a Thursday in late September, 3.5 years into the marriage, on the morning that Everett left for a 2-week business trip to Dallas. The project was a commercial development acquisition, a large mixed-use property in the design district that Everett's firm had been pursuing for several months, and the timeline required his physical presence for site assessments and investor meetings. He had kissed Sloane at 6:15 in the morning while she was still half asleep, had told her he loved her, had asked her to look after the house, by which they both understood he meant to look after his mother, and had rolled his carry-on out the front door of the east wing into the gray pre-dawn quiet. Sloane had gone back to sleep for 40 minutes, then risen, showered, dressed for work in the clothes she had laid out the night before, a charcoal theory blazer and dark trousers, and come downstairs to find Dorothea already seated at the kitchen island with a cup of tea and an expression that Sloane, in 3.5 years, had learned to identify as a thing about to be done. Dorothea had looked at her over the rim of the cup, set it down with a small and deliberate click and said, "Good morning, Sloane." I need your car keys. Sloane had stopped walking. She had turned and looked at her mother-in-law with a stillness that felt biological. I'm sorry. Your car keys, Dorothea had repeated, with the bright patience of someone explaining a reasonable thing. I need the Volvo today. The Porsche is in for service and I have appointments in the city. You can work from home. I have client meetings today, Sloane said. In person. Then reschedule them, Dorothea said, returning her attention to her tea as though the conversation had concluded. You're a junior associate. They'll wait. I'm a senior portfolio manager, Sloane said. And it's my car. Dorothea had set down her cup again, more slowly this time, and risen from the stool, and walked the 4 steps to the small basket near the garage door where Sloane's key fob sat in the side pocket of her work bag, which she had placed on the counter the night before. She had picked it up with 2 fingers, dropped it into the pocket of her St. John cardigan, and said, pleasantly and without inflection, while Everett is away, the household operates under my decisions. That's how this family works. You've had 3.5 years to learn that. She had paused at the door to the garage and turned back, and she had smiled the smile that Sloane had catalogued now in 312 separate instances across the course of her marriage, the smile that was satisfied not merely with the cruelty but with the elegance of it. A woman like you, she had said, doesn't deserve to drive anything I haven't approved. You'll walk everywhere until Everett gets back, or you'll call an Uber like the rest of your people. Either way. And she had walked into the garage and driven away in Sloane's Volvo. Sloane had stood in the kitchen for exactly 4 seconds. She had not cried. She had not moved to the window to watch the car back out of the driveway. She had picked up her coffee cup, taken 1 sip, set it on the counter, and walked to the small study at the back of the east wing, closed the door, sat down, and called her father. Gerald answered on the second ring, which meant he was already at his desk, which meant it was early but not too early, which meant he had been waiting for something, and Sloane had the impression, not for the first time, that her father understood the shape of situations the way a surveyor understands land, by taking measurements of things that are not yet visible. She told him what had happened. She told him the name on the key fob Dorothea had taken. She told him the exact words. When she finished, Gerald did not respond immediately, and in the quiet she could hear the specific and familiar sound of him opening the deep right-hand drawer of his desk where he kept the operational binders for the Whitmore Auto Group's franchise agreements. He said, "Is the Hargrove LLC still the entity on the title for the Range Rover she's been driving this week?" "The GLS is in service," Sloane said. "She's in my Volvo. But the second Range Rover, the autobiography, is in the second garage bay right now," Gerald said. "Good." He paused. "Sloane, I've been sitting on something for about 6 weeks waiting for the right moment to bring it to you. I think the right moment just found us." He paused again, and when he spoke his voice had the quality it took on when the calculation was already complete and only the action remained. Dorothea's Property Management LLC has been running vehicle expenses through a commercial financing line that was set up with a fraudulent asset declaration. Her CFO, the same man who handles the Callaway Holdings accounts, filed vehicle acquisition documents with falsified collateral statements on 3 separate occasions over the past 4 years. The fraud is documented. I have the originals. The vehicles titled under that LLC are legally subject to repossession under the terms of the fraudulent financing agreements, and I have been in contact with the relevant lending institutions since August. He said this in the way that he said most large things, which was quietly, in the same tone one might use to describe the weather. "I was going to talk to you about next steps this weekend, but I think we should move tonight instead." Sloane had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "Do you need me to do anything before you arrive?" Gerald had said, "Just go about your day normally, sweetheart. Call an Uber to your meetings. Come home this evening as usual. I'll be in the driveway by 8. And that was when Sloane Whitmore, senior portfolio manager, daughter of Gerald Whitmore of the Whitmore Auto Group, wife of Everett Callaway and daughter-in-law of Dorothea Hargrove Callaway, allowed herself one small, private, and entirely genuine smile. She picked up her phone, opened the Uber app, and requested a ride to her first client meeting of the morning. The driver arrived in 6 minutes in a clean black Honda Pilot, and Sloane climbed in with her briefcase, her laptop bag, and the absolute composure of a woman who already knew precisely how this story ended. What she did not let herself do, for the entire remainder of that day, was any of the things that would have satisfied Dorothea. She did not call Everett in Dallas to report what had happened, because she understood that Everett would call his mother, and that his mother would adjust her behavior temporarily and then resume it, and that this was not the solution. She did not speak to any of the household staff about the morning's incident, because the household staff answered to Dorothea first and would carry a report back within the hour. She did not reschedule her client meetings, and she did not allow the slight modification of her transportation to alter her professional presentation by a single degree. She arrived at her first meeting at 9:15, settled into the chair across the conference table from a hedge fund client whose portfolio she was restructuring across 4 asset classes, and proceeded to conduct a 90-minute meeting with the unhurried precision of someone who had not had their car stolen 3 hours earlier. She had 3 meetings total that day. She took lunch at her desk between the second and third, a salad from the cafe downstairs that she ate while reviewing the documents her father had referenced in their morning call, which he had sent to her encrypted personal email at 10:45. The documents were comprehensive. The fraudulent asset declarations in the Hargrove LLC financing applications were not subtle, once you knew how to look at them. They involved a pattern of inflated property valuations used as collateral on the vehicle financing lines, with the same 2-line description of a commercial property in Darien, appearing across 3 separate loan applications at progressively escalating estimated values, each increase unsupported by any independent appraisal documentation. The property in question, Sloane noted with a specific appreciation for the completeness of the situation, was itself mortgaged past its actual value through a separate instrument that the Callaway Holdings CFO had managed to keep off the consolidated balance sheet by running it through the Hargrove LLC as an intercompany receivable. It was not the most sophisticated financial fraud she had ever seen, but it was thorough enough to be prosecutable and documented enough to be irreversible. She forwarded the documents to her own attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei who practiced at a firm in Stamford and who had the specific combination of precision and aggression that Sloane had chosen her for. She included a single line of context. "These are time-sensitive. I'd like to discuss tonight if possible." Patricia had responded within 20 minutes. "I'm available at 7. Call me." The third client meeting ended at 4:30. Sloane took an Uber back to Greenwich and arrived at the Callaway estate at 5:15. Dorothea's car, Sloane's Volvo, was parked in the circular driveway at the front of the house rather than in the garage, which meant Dorothea had been in and out multiple times during the day and had not bothered to pull it fully in, a small and unnecessary demonstration of possession. Sloane walked past it without pausing, let herself in through the east wing entrance, changed out of her work clothes into a pair of dark jeans and a cashmere crew neck, and went to the kitchen to start dinner. She made roasted chicken with herbs from the windowsill arrangement that Dorothea had compared to a housekeeper's cooking. She made it well, basting it carefully, seasoning the skin with coarse salt and cracked pepper, and a brush of honey that made the whole east wing smell like warmth and competence. She set the table in the small dining room adjacent to the kitchen with the good linen and the everyday china, poured herself a glass of water, and when Dorothea came in from wherever she had been in the house and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen with a look of mild surprise at finding dinner already underway, Sloane turned from the stove and said, evenly and warmly, "I got home a little early. I hope chicken sounds good." Dorothea had stood in the doorway for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a moment. She looked at the table set neatly for 2. She looked at Sloane, standing at the stove in her cashmere crew neck with the composed expression of a woman who had experienced nothing unusual that day. Something crossed Dorothea's face, not guilt exactly, more like the faint unease of a person who has been waiting for a reaction and has not received one. Then she said, "I'll eat in my sitting room," and went back down the hall. Sloane had eaten alone at the small dining table, finished her chicken and her water, washed the dishes, and at 6:50 went back to the study and called Patricia. The call lasted 45 minutes. Patricia was thorough and direct, as she always was, and the picture she painted at the end of the call was one that Sloane had already sketched in her own mind but which now had the architectural weight of legal specificity. The fraudulent financing arrangements on the vehicles registered to Hargrove Property Management, LLC created grounds for repossession that were clean and legally unambiguous. The lending institutions involved, 2 of which were regional banks whose commercial lending operations worked closely with the Whitmore Auto Group's preferred financing partners, had been informed by Gerald's team. Patricia confirmed that the repossession orders could be executed through proper legal channels within 24 hours of the formal complaint filing, which Gerald's attorneys had already initiated that afternoon. She confirmed that the personal assets of the individual guarantors on the LLC's financing instruments, which included Dorothea as the LLC's registered managing member, could be subject to civil liability for the fraudulent declarations. She confirmed that the vehicles currently titled under that LLC, all 6 of them, including both Range Rovers, the Mercedes GLS, the Porsche Cayenne, the Escalade, and the BMW 7 Series, were recoverable under the terms of the relevant agreements. She paused and then added, with the particular dryness of a woman who had spent 20 years in financial litigation, and the Volvo, if it is currently in the possession of the LLC's managing member without the owner's consent, should probably be included in a separate demand letter. Sloane said, "Let's do that." Patricia said, "I'll have everything filed by 10 tonight." At 7:58, Sloane put on a light jacket, walked out through the east wing entrance, and stood on the stone path that led from the side of the house to the circular driveway at the front, where her Volvo was still parked. The evening was cool and still, the sky over the estate gone fully dark with the particular velvety black of a Connecticut September night. The exterior lights along the driveway were on, the amber glow of them pooling in elongated ovals across the pale gravel. The oaks that lined the long approach to the house had begun their slow turn toward copper and rust, and the air carried the first cold undertone of autumn, the smell of fallen leaves and cooling earth and the clean, honest end of things. Sloane stood in the quiet and looked at her own car sitting where Dorothea had left it, and she breathed once slowly, and then she heard the crunch of tires turning in from the road. Her father's Tahoe rolled up the long driveway at the measured pace of a man who was not in a hurry, which was the pace at which Gerald Whitmore did everything. He pulled up alongside the Volvo, stopped and got out. He was wearing his dark jeans and a gray pullover and the navy canvas jacket he wore in autumn, and he was carrying a briefcase in one hand and a velvet key box, deep burgundy, the kind used for presentation at high-end dealerships, in the other. He looked at Sloane and then at the Volvo beside him and then at the house, and the expression on his face was the one she had known since childhood, the one that meant the calculation was done and the outcome was correct and there was nothing left to do but execute. He said, "You okay?" She said, "I'm okay, Dad." He said, "Good." He held out the velvet key box. "I had this pulled from the Greenwich showroom about an hour ago. It's yours. The title is already in your name in the trust." She opened the box. Inside, on the cushioned ivory interior, sat a key fob for a Range Rover Sport, Carpathian Gray, with a small folded title card tucked beside it bearing her name in clean printed type. She looked at it for a long moment, running one thumb across the key fob's surface, and then she closed the box. Gerald set his briefcase on the hood of the Tahoe, opened it, and removed a document folder which he handed to her. "The complaint filing is confirmed as of 40 minutes ago. Patricia has copies. The lending institutions have their authorization letters." He closed the briefcase and looked at the house again. "Is she home?" "In her sitting room," Sloane said. Gerald nodded once. "Let's go inside." What happened next was the kind of scene that Sloane would replay in very specific and luminous detail for a long time afterward, not because of its volume, which was negligible, or its drama, which was architectural rather than theatrical, but because of the particular quality of truth that it had, the truth of a thing falling into its actual shape after a long period of being held in a false one. Dorothea was in her sitting room on the second floor, the room she used in the evenings when she was not entertaining, a pale-walled, carefully appointed room with a gas fireplace and 2 deep armchairs upholstered in a muted sage linen and a writing desk at which she was seated when Sloane knocked and opened the door. She was wearing a silk robe in a shade of pale champagne and reading glasses with a thin gold frame, and she looked up from the papers on her desk with the specific expression of someone interrupted in their own home by a person who ought to know their place. And then she saw Gerald standing in the hallway behind Sloane and the expression shifted. Because she did not know Gerald personally, she had met him twice, at the wedding and at one family dinner where he had said almost nothing and eaten his meal and left early in the Tahoe, and both times she had categorized him with the swift and inaccurate efficiency she applied to everyone who did not fit her existing map of significant people. But she was a woman who had spent 40 years reading the specific body language of men with money, and she read it now in the way he stood in the hallway, in the quality of his stillness, in the briefcase beside him, and something behind her eyes went very briefly uncertain before she reassembled it. She removed her reading glasses and set them on the desk with deliberateness. She said, "This is an unexpected hour for a visit." A pause. "Everett isn't here." Sloane said, "I know. This isn't about Everett." She stepped into the sitting room and Gerald followed, and Sloane set Patricia's demand letter on the writing desk beside Dorothea's reading glasses. The paper was clean white, headed with Patricia's firm's name in sharp black type, and it was 1 page long, which was all it needed to be. "This is a formal demand letter regarding the vehicle in your possession. My Volvo. It will need to be returned tonight." She set the document folder with the complaint filings beside it. "And this is a copy of the fraud complaint filed this evening with the relevant lending institutions and the Connecticut Department of Banking regarding the financing arrangements on the vehicles registered to Hargrove Property Management, LLC." Dorothea had not moved. She was looking at the documents on her desk with an expression that Sloane had never seen on her face before, which was the expression of a woman encountering something she had not prepared for and could not instantly categorize. She said slowly, "I don't know what you think you're." "The asset declarations on the vehicle financing applications," Sloane said, "used a commercial property in Darien as collateral across 3 separate instruments at 3 different valuations, none of which were supported by independent appraisals. The property itself is mortgaged beyond its actual value and has been carried on the LLC's books as an intercompany receivable to keep it off the consolidated Callaway Holdings balance sheet. Your CFO's signature is on all 3 applications. Your signature as managing member of Hargrove LLC is on the guarantor certifications." She paused and let that sit in the room for a moment, the way a good attorney lets evidence sit, not filling the silence, just letting it be present and complete. "This isn't a misunderstanding, Dorothea. It's a documented fraud." The room was very quiet. The gas fireplace made its small, steady sound. The lamplight on the writing desk illuminated the clean surface of Patricia's demand letter. Dorothea looked from the documents to Sloane, and then to Gerald, who had remained standing near the door with his briefcase and his quiet, complete attention, and she said in a voice that had lost its particular music and become something thinner, "Who are you?" Gerald said, simply and without performance, "Gerald Whitmore. Whitmore Auto Group. My franchises hold the dealer agreements for 7 of the 14 brands represented in the Callaway Holdings vehicle fleet, including both brands on your personal LLC's vehicle registrations." He paused. "I'm also Sloane's father." Dorothea sat very still. The kind of stillness that is not composure but its precise opposite, the stillness of a person in the moment before a structure collapses who has not yet begun to run. Her hand rested on the surface of the desk beside the demand letter, and Sloane could see that the knuckles had gone white, though the rest of Dorothea's expression held its shape through what was clearly a significant act of will. Sloane looked at her mother-in-law for a long, even moment. 3.5 years of Sunday brunches. 3.5 years of lovely little firms and very convincing replicas and your people and outside Guadalajara. 3.5 years of patient, precise, unhurried accumulation. She said, "I've been in this house for 3.5 years watching you decide that knowing someone's worth meant you had a plan for them. My father taught me a long time ago not to let that happen." She picked up her Volvo key fob from the corner of Dorothea's desk where it had been placed that morning after her mother-in-law returned from the city. She held it for a moment. Then she set it back down on the desk, beside the demand letter. "You can leave the Volvo in the driveway tonight. The repossession teams will be here at 6 in the morning for the other vehicles. I'd suggest you arrange alternate transportation before then." A pause. "Patricia will be in touch about the civil liability on the fraudulent declarations. I'd get your own attorney on the phone tonight." She turned toward the door and Gerald stepped back into the hallway to let her through, and they walked together down the stairs and out through the front door of the Callaway estate into the cool September evening. At the base of the front steps, under the amber glow of the exterior lights, Gerald set his briefcase down and said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, "She'll have someone call Everett tonight." "I know," Sloane said. "What do you want to do about that?" "I'm going to call him first," Sloane said. "Right now, before she gets to him." Gerald nodded once with the particular approval of a man who understands that speed is sometimes more important than preparation. "Good." Sloane called Everett from the driveway, standing beside her father's Tahoe in the amber light. It rang twice. He answered with the easy warmth of a man who has spent a good day at work and expects this call to be ordinary. "Hey you. Everything okay?" Sloane said. "Everett, I need to tell you what happened today, and I need you to listen all the way through before you respond." And she told him. She told him about the keys that morning. She told him the exact words. "A woman like you walk everywhere the rest of your people." She told him about the fraud documentation, about Patricia's filing, about her father arriving at 8 o'clock with a briefcase and a velvet key box. She told him that by morning the vehicles would be collected and that Dorothea was currently upstairs with 2 legal documents on her writing desk and the understanding, for the first time in 3.5 years, of exactly who she had been managing. Everett was silent for a very long time, long enough that Sloane could hear the ambient noise of his Dallas hotel room, the hum of the climate system, the distant sound of traffic 14 floors below. He said, "Finally, Sloane. The keys. She actually took your keys." "Out of my work bag," Sloane said, "in front of me, and told me to call an Uber like the rest of my people." Another silence. Then, with a quality in his voice she had not heard before, or perhaps had heard and not recognized, the quality of a man arriving somewhere he had been avoiding for a long time, he said, "I'm so sorry. I should have, a long time ago I should have." He stopped. "I'm sorry." Sloane said, "I know. She meant it. We have a lot to talk about when you get home." He said, "I'll be on the first flight tomorrow morning." She said, "Finish the week. The work matters. We'll talk when you're back." And she meant that too, because she was not a woman who made decisions from the emotion of a moment, and the conversation she needed to have with her husband required more than a red-eye flight and a week of unresolved guilt. It required him to be fully present, and she was willing to wait for that, because she had learned from Gerald that patience held long enough compounded into something more powerful than urgency. She said goodnight. She ended the call. She looked at her father, who had been standing quietly beside the Tahoe throughout the call in the manner of a man who understands when to be present and when to be silent. He said, "You want to take her out for a drive?" Sloane looked at him. Then she looked toward the end of the driveway, where the Carpathian gray Range Rover Sport sat clean and perfect in the road light, the kind of vehicle that did not announce itself but did not need to. She said, "Yeah, Ido." Gerald smiled. It was a small smile, the kind he reserved for things that had gone correctly after a long time of going otherwise. He handed her the velvet key box and said, "Drive safe." She walked to the end of the driveway and pressed the fob and heard the clean, solid unlock, and she got in and adjusted the seat and the mirrors with the specific unhurried attention of a person settling into something that has always belonged to them, and she drove. The morning that followed was witnessed by everyone on the estate. The repossession teams arrived at 5:58 for minutes early in 2 flatbed trucks and a professional transport van, the kind used for high-value vehicle collection rather than consumer repo work, which meant the process was efficient, documented to the letter, and conducted without a single raised voice. The household's property manager was handed copies of the legal authorization documents by the lead coordinator, a calm and methodical man named Davis, before his team set foot in the garages. The property manager, who had worked for Dorothea for 9 years and had spent a significant portion of those 9 years absorbing the kind of workplace experience that does not appear in performance reviews, looked at the documents, looked at Davis, and stepped back and said nothing and let them work. They took the first Range Rover from the main garage bay. The autobiography, navy with ivory interior, the vehicle Dorothea had driven most frequently and referenced most often in conversation as evidence of her taste. They took the Escalade from beside it, the BMW 7 Series from the third bay, the Mercedes GLS, returned from its service appointment the previous afternoon and parked with fresh wax still gleaming on the hood, from the side motor court, the Porsche Cayenne from the secondary garage at the back of the property, where it had been parked since its service pickup. Davis and his team moved with the organized quiet of people doing legal documented work, logging each vehicle on a transfer manifest, attaching copies of the repossession orders to the paperwork packets that would be filed with each lending institution by the end of the business day, and they were done with the estate collection in 41 minutes. Simultaneously, a second team was at the Callaway Holdings parking facility in Stamford, collecting the 2 additional fleet vehicles, and both units were loaded and off that property by 6:45. Dorothea appeared in the doorway of the estate's main entrance at 6:20. She was dressed impeccably in a St. John's suit, ivory with pearl buttons, and her hair was set, and she was wearing the pearl earrings she wore to events of importance. Sloane would think about that detail later, the deliberate dressing, the choice to face this moment in the uniform of the woman she had always presented herself to be, and she would understand it as a kind of courage of a very limited and self-defeating variety, the courage of someone who believes that presentation can substitute for substance right up until the moment when the flatbed pulls out of the driveway. Dorothea stood in the doorway and watched the last vehicle, the Escalade, loaded onto the second flatbed. She had a cell phone pressed to her ear. Her attorney, presumably, or possibly the Callaway Holdings CFO, though the CFO, Sloane would learn later, had already by this hour that morning been on a call with his own attorney discussing the terms of a cooperation agreement and was unlikely to be taking Dorothea's calls. The second flatbed rolled down the long driveway. Davis paused at the front steps to hand Dorothea a copy of the completed transfer manifest, which she accepted without looking at him, her eyes tracking the truck as it turned out of the gate and disappeared onto the road. Then she looked across the sweep of the circular driveway. Sloane was standing at the side entrance to the east wing, her laptop bag over one shoulder, the velvet key box in her hand. She was wearing the charcoal blazer again, the one she had worn the morning Dorothea had taken her keys, and she was holding a coffee cup, and she looked in every visible way like a woman who had slept well and was having an ordinary Thursday morning. Their eyes met across the gravel of the circular driveway. Sloane did not smile. She did not raise her coffee cup in any kind of toast. She simply looked at her mother-in-law for one long, even, complete moment, the look of a woman who has said everything there is to say and is now simply observing the accuracy of the outcome. Then she walked to the Carpathian gray Range Rover Sport parked at the side of the driveway, opened it, put her laptop bag in the passenger seat, and drove to work. The civil liability proceedings unfolded over the following 4 months with the thoroughness that Patricia's firm brought to everything it touched. The fraudulent declarations on the Hargrove LLC vehicle financing were substantiated in full. The CFO of Callaway Holdings, faced with the documented evidence and the clear attribution of his signature to the false applications, cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced penalty structure, and in doing so provided a detailed account of the decision-making chain that led to the fraudulent filings, an account that placed Dorothea at the directing center of each one. Dorothea retained her own attorney, an older man from a Greenwich firm who had handled the Callaway family's estate matters for 15 years and who, it became apparent over the course of the proceedings, was not a financial fraud litigator and was learning the relevant law at approximately the same pace as his client. He attempted, on 2 occasions, to characterize the fraudulent valuations as good faith estimation errors by an overworked CFO operating under ambiguous instructions. Patricia disposed of this argument with the particular efficiency of someone who has read the same defense memo 17 times in 20 years of practice. The original documents, the actual appraisals, the actual signed guarantor certifications, the actual email correspondence between Dorothea and the CFO in the weeks before each filing, did not support a good faith interpretation. They supported a deliberate one. Dorothea's personal guarantor liability on the 3 fraudulent instruments totaled approximately $2.3 million. Combined with the penalties assessed by the Connecticut Department of Banking and the civil damages awarded to the lending institutions, the judgment required her to liquidate a substantial portion of the personal investment portfolio she had always kept separate from the Callaway family's joint holdings, a portfolio in 4 different brokerage accounts that she had referred to, in the one conversation Sloane had overheard as my independence, and which she had apparently considered structurally untouchable by anything the marriage, the family business, or ordinary consequence might produce. It was not untouchable. Patricia touched it with a court order in November, 6 weeks after the complaint filing, and by the time the final judgment was issued in January, the portfolio had been drawn down by 63% to satisfy the liability. What remained was enough to sustain Dorothea, but not to sustain her in the form she had occupied for the previous 3 decades. The Greenwich estate was Callaway Holdings' property and not hers personally to sell, but the cost of maintaining her share of the household on her reduced independent income became untenable within 2 quarters, and by the following spring she had relocated to the townhouse in Westchester, 2,000 square feet of good bones and older fixtures and a parking spot in a shared garage where her car, a used Buick Enclave purchased through a dealership in Yonkers with cash, sat beside the cars of neighbors whose names she did not know. She had purchased the Buick through that particular Yonkers dealership. Sloane was informed by her father on one of their Saturday morning calls, because it was genuinely the nearest dealership to the townhouse that offered the model and the price point her budget now required. Gerald had delivered this detail without editorial, in the manner of a man reporting an accurate fact, and then there had been a brief quiet on the line and Sloane had said, "Is it one of ours?" And Gerald had said, "No, Yonkers isn't our territory." And they had both been quiet for a moment in the specific and mutually understood satisfaction of a thing that has resolved itself correctly. Everett had returned from Dallas not on the first flight the morning after Sloane's call, because she had told him not to, but at the end of his scheduled 2 weeks, arriving home to a house in which the garages were empty and his mother was unreachable by phone and the east wing smelled, still, faintly of roasted chicken. He had stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at the herbs on the windowsill, and then he had sat down at the island and waited for Sloane to come home from work. The conversation they had that evening was long and honest and painful in the way that necessary conversations are painful, not because of anger but because of the particular grief of seeing clearly something you have spent a long time choosing not to see. Everett cried at one point, which surprised him more than it surprised Sloane. He said again that he was sorry. He said it several times in several different ways, and each time he said it Sloane believed him a little more, because the repetition was not a performance but an attempt to find the version that was specific enough to be true. He said, "She told me my whole life that she was protecting me, protecting the family. I didn't understand that protection and control were the same word in her vocabulary." Sloane said, "I know. I think you always understood it somewhere. You just needed it to cost you something before you could look at it directly." He said, "It cost you. Not me." She said, "It cost both of us. But we're still here." They separated for 6 weeks, not officially and not publicly, but physically, Everett taking a room at a hotel in Stamford while they each worked with their own therapists and then with a couple's therapist, a woman in Westport who asked direct questions and did not allow either of them to use the other's behavior as a place to put their own avoidance. The process was uncomfortable and clarifying in the way that all genuinely useful things are uncomfortable and clarifying. At the end of the 6 weeks, Everett moved back. Not into the east wing of his mother's estate. Into the modern Colonial in Westport, 3 streets from the water, that Sloane had found and that they had decided on together, with a proper garage and a kitchen with an island and a windowsill with southern exposure where the herbs would get enough light. The title was in both their names. The decision to buy it had been made jointly, without consultation with anyone at the Callaway estate. And when Everett's family's real estate attorney had raised a procedural question about whether the purchase should be coordinated through Callaway Holdings, Everett had said, flatly and without elaboration, no, and that had been the end of it. Sloane was promoted to managing director at the wealth management firm 11 months after the September in question. The announcement was made on a Tuesday morning in a brief company-wide email that named her and her new responsibilities and the effective date, and which her colleague Caroline, who was still a client through her husband's hedge fund, responded to with a text that said, "I knew it. That patient financial instrument thing. It compounded." Sloane had read the text in the parking garage of her office building, sitting in the Carpathian Grey Range Rover Sport before getting out, and she had laughed, a real and genuine laugh, the kind that costs nothing and arrives from a place of actual ease. She managed a team of 12. Her client portfolio's combined value had grown to a figure that she knew, with the specific precision of someone who tracks these things carefully, was more than twice the value of Dorothea's pre-judgment investment accounts at their peak. She had not shared this figure with Dorothea. She had not shared it with anyone except her father, who had received it on a Saturday morning call with a single which was the highest denomination of his approval. The house in Westport was good. It was theirs in the specific way that things are yours when you have chosen them without duress, when nobody else's name is on the arrangement, when the kitchen smells in the evening like whatever you have decided to cook. Sloane kept herbs on the windowsill, thyme and rosemary and a small pot of basil that required more attention than the others but was worth it. The island was wide enough for 2 people to have coffee at the same time, facing the same direction, looking out the window at the yard where the oaks were beginning, that autumn, to turn copper and rust. Gerald came on weekends sometimes and sat at the island and drank his coffee and listened to Sloane talk about her week, and occasionally offered a thought or a question in the measured cadence of a man who has learned that the most useful things are said sparingly. Everett, who had taken more time than most to arrive at an accurate understanding of who his father-in-law was, had by this point a genuine and uncomplicated ease with Gerald that Sloane found quietly satisfying, the ease of two people who have agreed to be honest with each other and have found that honesty, practiced consistently, is less costly than its alternative. On one of these weekend mornings, about 14 months after the September repossessions, Gerald had arrived carrying a small paper bag from a bakery in Fairfield and set it on the island and poured himself a coffee and said, without preamble, "You remember the Yonkers dealership I mentioned?" Sloane said, "The one that sold her the Buick." Gerald said, "We acquired it in April. It's ours now." Sloane had looked at her father for a long moment. He was looking at his coffee with the expression of a man making a neutral observation about an ordinary business development. She said, "Dad," he said, "it was a fair price. Good location. Strong service department." She said, "Did you know she still takes it there?" He said, "I was informed of that, yes." He took a sip of his coffee. "I have no plans to change anything about how that service department operates. They're a good team." Sloane said, "But you know." Gerald set down his cup. He looked at her with the specific expression she had known since the morning of her 16th birthday, the expression that meant the calculation had been completed some time ago, and the outcome was exactly what it was supposed to be. He said, "I just wanted you to know I know." She looked at her father, this quiet man in his dark wash jeans and his navy canvas jacket, who had built 14 dealerships and a substantial trust and a single, overriding principle about worth and plans and the importance of controlling which one came first, and she felt, as she always felt in these moments, the full and unhurried weight of what it meant to have been raised by someone who was completely, permanently, and unconditionally on her side. She said, "Thank you, Dad." He said, "Don't thank me. Just remember the number." She said, "I always do." Outside, through the kitchen window, the yard was bright with October light, and the oaks were at their peak, every leaf a separate burning thing, and the morning was very quiet and it was hers. She had learned in the end what her father had always known, that the most effective revenge is not the one executed in anger. It is the one assembled over years with patience and precision and the deep, unglamorous discipline of a woman who knows exactly what she is worth, who has never needed anyone else to tell her, and who has spent every hour of the long accumulation simply waiting for the moment when the world catches up to what she already knew. Dorothea Hargrove Calloway had looked at her once across a Sunday brunch table and decided, in the swift and inaccurate way of people who mistake performance for substance, that she understood what she was dealing with. She had been given 3.5 years to revise that assessment. She had chosen not to, and the morning the flatbeds came and the garages went empty, and the papers sat on the writing desk in the lamplight, she had finally arrived at the understanding that Sloane had been carrying since long before the first Sunday brunch, since the morning of her 16th birthday, since the first time a man she trusted had handed her not a car but a number and said, "Know what you're worth before anyone else in the room gets the chance." Sloane knew. She had always known. And now so did everyone else.